Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Ashanti Edwards, the Director for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer Online with LSC as part of the ASCB's Professional Development webinar series. Today, our facilitator, Karen Howes, will be introducing our featured author for this installment of Online with LSC. Karen, you can now turn your camera on.
Welcome everyone to this session of Online with LSC. I'm Karen Hales from Davidson College, and I'm facilitating today's session. I wanted to remind everyone that the goal of this series is to be a virtual journal club. We provide behind the scenes insights into education scholarship. I really encourage everyone to submit questions as we go along using the Q&A feature, and I will weave your questions into the conversation. There will be a brief overview from our featured author, and then most of our session will be a Q&A, a conversation. So now I'm very pleased to introduce as our featured author, Jeanette Zambrano, who is a doctoral student in the Urban Education Policy Program at the University of Southern California within the Rossier School of Education there. Jeanette previously earned a master's in social psychology from San Diego State as well. She's lead author with 3 collaborators on a paper in the September 1st issue of LSC on the effect on student interest of highlighting prosocial affordances of science in textbooks. So as I said, Jeanette will give a relatively brief overview, and then we'll spend most of the session in conversation. So Jeanette, welcome, and now over to you.
Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. As Karen said, I'm just going to give a very brief overview and then we'll get into the questions. So let's see. Okay, so many college students abandon their goal of completing a degree in the sciences. And a lot of this dropout tends to occur at the beginning stages when students are completing their foundational science coursework. And this trend, at least in the United States, tends to be more pronounced for Latino, Black, and Native or Indigenous students, which then of course translate to persisting racial achievement gaps in higher education. One hypothesis, one perspective that can help us understand this trend a little bit more is the goal congruity perspective. And within this context, the goal congruity perspective suggests that STEM fields are not perceived as affording communal or prosocial opportunities to help other people. And many studies have found that Black, Latino, and Indigenous students tend to report a greater motivation to benefit others and the community through their work. And when they believe that science has little utility for helping others, when they struggle to see the connections between what they're doing and how that translates to benefiting others, these students tend to report less interest in science. Now, science has many implications for helping people, helping others, benefiting communities and humanity as a whole. So my colleagues and I, we were curious if there are things that we can change in the educational environment, things that we can tweak or enhance to help students see that science can be used for prosocial purposes to hopefully sustain interest. So we decided to study textbooks and, to examine whether text could be an avenue through which we can change or emphasize this belief that science can be used to benefit others. So our research question was, can science text be enhanced with prosocial utility value to promote students' interest in science? And to test this question, what we did is we took a science textbook chapter from Rees et al. 2014. And here's a picture of what our textbook looked like. And we manipulated this chapter in 3 ways. So in our prosocial utility value textbook, we added connections about how the science topic could be used to help others or benefit communities. In the general utility value text, we added information about how the science topic could be used for humans, but not in a particularly prosocial way. And then in the neutral condition, we didn't add any utility. We just added regular information about the topic. And then in terms of the study procedure, what we did first is we measured their baseline interest in the topic and their initial beliefs about the topic. And this is before their scheduled appointment. And then once they had established their interest, we asked them to complete a 2-question survey. And this was based on their 3 questions. And then we manipulated this chapter in 3 ways. So in our prosocial utility value textbook, we added connections about how the science topic could be used to help others or benefit communities. In the general utility value textbook, we added information about how the science topic could be used for humans, but not in a particularly prosocial way. And then in terms of the they came into the lab for their appointment. We brought them in, we told them to read the textbook chapter for about 25 to 30 minutes. And then afterwards, they would be giving a quiz on what they read. And we did this to give them a purpose for engaging in the task. And so after they engaged with the textbook, we then measured their prosocial affordance beliefs, their interest in the science topic, their perceptions of competence with the topic, and then they took the quiz. And what we expected to find is that students who engaged with the prosocial textbook would report greater interest in the topic. And we hypothesized that beliefs that the topic would afford prosocial opportunities would be the reason why students experience greater interest. So we expected that the effect between the textbook condition and then the outcome, which was interest, would be mediated by changes in these beliefs. And so what we found first is that the two control conditions, the general utility and the neutral condition, they didn't differ. So we just combined them into one control group for model parsimony. And what we found is that students who engaged with the prosocial textbook reported greater beliefs that the topic could be used to benefit others. And they also reported greater interest in the science topic. And this path was mediated as we suspected. So changes in or increases in science interest were mediated through changes in beliefs about the science topic as affording prosocial opportunities. We also suspected that this model, these effects would be more pronounced, stronger for underrepresented minority students compared to well-represented students, which in this case, Asian students and also white European American students. So we conducted multiple group analysis to essentially test these paths and if they were different for different groups of people, and our findings were essentially supported. So we found that this model was stronger for underrepresented minority students compared to Asian American students and white American students. All of these paths were significant for all groups except for one, which I think is important to note. So for Asian students, prosocial affordance beliefs did predict more interest in the science topic. So this suggests that prosocial affordance beliefs are important for them. But unfortunately, our manipulation, our textbook, didn't change their beliefs. So that's this effect right here, 0.29. And the standard error was 0.32. So it was positive, but the large standard error essentially rendered that effect non-significant. And we could talk a little bit more about why we think that might have been. But overall, our results, our hypotheses were supported. And then in the second study, we were curious about whether textbooks already contained prosocial utility value content and to what extent they had it. So what we did is we collected 9 science textbooks that were used in introductory level science courses. 3 of them were in biology, 3 from physics, and 3 in chemistry. And we coded them for the presence of prosocial utility value content. And what we did is we took page samples from each chapter and we coded 1,551 textbook pages in total. And of those pages, we found 20 prosocial utility value connections. And what we found is that nearly all of the connections were in biology. So 19 were from biology textbooks, 1 from physics, and then 0 were found in chemistry. So what this study suggested to us is that texts are currently missing out on opportunities to enhance interest through this mechanism of prosocial utility connections in science learning content. That's it for my brief overview, but I just want to briefly acknowledge my co-authors, Garam Lee, Christina Leal, and Dr. Justin Thoman, as well as the many research assistants that help us collect this data. And then the science professors that loaned us the textbooks that we coded, as well as the LSE team who helped us improve our manuscript through revisions and offering some insight into how we can improve it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeanette. Go ahead and unshare your slides so that we're just faces on the screen for everybody now. There's one clarification question in the Q&A already, and Melinda would like to know examples of prosocial versus general utility. Can you explain how those are differentiated in your study?
Yeah, so I can't remember the exact science content, but the one connection that we made for one was like in the prosocial condition, it was like the topic was about plant diversity, and so we talked about how like knowing the intricacies of that could be used to stock to make sure that communities have a good assortment of fruits and vegetables throughout the year. And so knowledge about that could be used in order to ensure that communities have a wider selection of foods. That was one of the prosocial connections. And then in the general utility, that same connection was improving paper for manufacturers, so making more durable paper. One was kind of more centered on communities and people, and then the other one was more on like factory uses, essentially. Yeah.
Great. Well, I expect we'll spend a lot of the time talking about how to implement your ideas in a classroom and textbook context, but I did want to ask one methodological question before we spend more of the time on implementation. And you had a passage in the paper saying that a lab experiment like the one you designed mimics what actually happens in a real classroom. And so for those less familiar with that literature, could you explain how we know that this sort of experiment, or you've invited volunteers and so on, how do we know that that truly is reflective of what's going to happen in an actual classroom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the straightforward answer is we don't know for sure. So when designing experiments, we could think of validity in two ways. We could think of, we have internal validity and then we have external validity. And so internal validity usually comes from lab experiments, such as this one, in which we controlled for a lot of things and we have a high degree of confidence that the causal relationship that we're testing is trustworthy and it's not being influenced by the factors. So in this study, we had participants come into the same room, they engaged with the same computers, they had the same instructions presented to them. And so the only thing that we changed in the environment was the textbook. And so differences in response patterns should be attributed to the one thing that we changed, right? And by contrast, external validity refers to the extent to which a study could be generalized in the real world. So studies that occur in the real world have higher external validity. But they also tend to have lower validity, lower internal validity. So for example, if we conducted the study in like real classes, like let's say we randomly assigned people different classrooms, different textbook versions, it would have high external validity, but low internal validity because there's so many things that could influence that effect. It could be the teacher, maybe they just like the teacher more and that created more interest. Maybe it was the time of day, so later classes versus earlier classes. And so there tends to be this like inverse relationship between internal validity and external validity. So for lab studies, it's important to make an argument for external validity. Why we think that these findings should be, we would expect them to function similarly in the real world. And to do this, we need to get participants to experience the same thing that they would outside of the class. So we gave them the purpose for learning the textbook, the purpose of the quiz to try to get students the same similar state of mind as they would in the real world. And I feel confident that we were able to do that because of what we saw when we were collecting data. And I'll give an example. When we were, the first few weeks that we started to collect data and we were running the study, research assistants, the participants were approaching research assistants after the study to ask for their quiz grades. And so we didn't expect that. I mean, in our protocol, we were just like, thank you for coming, have a great day, bye. And so when we started noticing that they wanted to know about how they did, and we noticed that this was happening more and more, we created this like answer key. And we put these answer keys on a table near the door. And we told them, you know, thanks for coming in. If you got your answer scores, you can check out your scores on the way out. And we did notice that a lot of students did check out their scores and see how they performed. So the way I see it, because validity is an argument, I see this as at least one piece of evidence to suggest that students were engaged in this task. And they seemed to care about it, even though their performance wasn't tied to any external reward, right? There was no reason. And so to me, that suggests that we were able to create that psychological realism, that students would engage, students engaged in the task in our labs, similar to how they would for a real class.
Got it, thank you. All right, so the next question, many STEM educators are of course focusing really hard on retention of students from underrepresented groups. And we will definitely want to apply your findings in the context of our specific fields. And so I'm a cell and molecular biologist, and I find that there's a bit of a conundrum sometimes because prosocial utility value for a given topic might not be known at the time that something is discovered. There's a lot of serendipity as people figure out basic science and then later see downstream value. And one example, CRISPR gene editing, the initial observations were just these odd repeats of DNA sequences in bacterial genomes. And it wasn't for many years that things progressed to understanding the gene editing functionality. Another example is the study of the ACE2 gene and protein, which 20 years later became known as the receptor for the virus that causes COVID-19. So how would you suggest framing things how would educators frame things when prosocial utility value might be indirect or not even known yet with regard to a certain topic?
Yeah, so the first has to do with what to do about basic science that has indirect applications to prosocial goals. In that case, I would suggest to emphasize the importance of the piece of information. So emphasize that without this particular study or this particular piece of knowledge or concept, the rest would not be possible. So I'm thinking about it in terms of like a chain, right? One thing affects another thing and knowledge about that thing affects another thing. So I would just suggest to emphasize the importance of that particular concept. And then the second part of the question, what to do about conveying the importance of the prosocial utility for a concept or something that isn't known yet, right? That's tough. My suggestion would be to speculate on the potential value that a topic could have. When professors apply for government funding, like through NSF or NIH, you talk about broader impacts or potential translational impacts. So I would approach it the same way. I would approach teaching in the same way as you would like that. I think it's safe to speculate and to wonder that something could be used for other things. I think the key is just to attach the topic or the concept to a larger problem or a larger goal that affects people.
Sounds good, thank you. So just a reminder for attendees, please put your questions into the Q&A feature and I will weave your questions into the conversation. So my next question is, can you speculate on whether the described prosocial utility value works better or less well if it has to do with the topic where something's already been described in the past and it's had its value in the past? Or is it more effective on students' interest if it's applying to a currently explored area where it's maybe a new mystery or an unfinished area of exploration?
Yeah, so my speculation is that both matter. So first, I think it's important for people to have success stories and to see that, because I think that gives the impression that if we're engaged in this work, it's actually going to lead to progress and it has implications for meeting goals. So what I'm thinking is like social modeling, for example, seeing that other people are engaged in work, maybe hearing stories of other people doing work that leads to positive outcomes. I think that tells people that they can do it too. And then I think it's also important to discuss prosocial utility within the context of an unfinished area of exploration because it provides the reason for engaging in the task. So both are important. The first is important because it conveys that it's possible to accomplish a prosocial goal in science using the scientific process. And then the unfinished areas convey that it's important to keep putting in the work to reach other future similar goals.
Got it. So when I was reading your paper, I made a connection actually between the implications of your work and some thoughts that I had in my own LSC essay, which I talked about a few weeks ago in this webinar series. And this has to do with genetic conditions and disability. So on the one hand, describing prosocial utility value for genetics topics might include coverage of possible cures or treatments for genetic conditions. But on the other hand, if you use as a default assumption the medical model of disability, which in other words is that you're assuming the disability is something to be fixed, in quotes, that can be invalidating to members of the disability community. So I'm wondering, how can we navigate the need for asserting prosocial utility value while also being mindful of the possibly problematic assumptions inherent in those assertions?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I hear you, because on the one hand, we know from studies that people have a high motivation to help other people. But on the other hand, treating condition, treating people, this could essentially invalidate them in many ways. So I think my suggestion would be to be mindful and reflect on any deficit language that we might be using. We should probably avoid using words like fix, cure, eradicate. We should avoid language that positions things as good or as bad. And instead, we should rely on more asset-based language that validates the dignity of people. So instead of saying things like fix deafness, we should probably say things like increasing accessibility. And then some of your suggestions that you also made in your essay, using atypical and typical instead of normal or abnormal. I think these are excellent suggestions, and I think that they're highly compatible with asserting prosocial utility value in effective and sensitive ways. I think this is a great question, though, and I think it's important. And I can see I can see future work coming out of how to explore more concrete recommendations for teaching, so that people are validated in the classroom. Good question.
Great. One observation in your paper was that the students who read the prosocial textbook experienced lower perceptions of their own competence. Mm-hmm. And so could you discuss your speculations about this finding?
Yeah, that was an interesting finding. So first, it's important to note that although they reported lower perceptions of competence, that didn't actually translate to lower actual competence. So students performed the same on the quiz across the 3 conditions. The means on those were almost like, the scores were almost the same. What we think could have happened is that the prosocial examples that we selected may have conveyed more complexity than the examples that we included in the 2 other conditions. In other words, the neutral content and the general utility content may have been more straightforward. And then, the prosocial one could have been more complex, which could have been interpreted as also more challenging, but it was more interesting. It's hard to know for sure because we weren't expecting that finding. So I think for future studies, it would be good to take that into account, content complexity, and see how that may or may not influence interest and perceptions of competence.
Great. So I was also interested in your study number 2, where you're looking at the textbooks and coding explicit versus implicitly expressed prosocial utility value. You are really focusing on the explicit expressions of that utility value. Yeah. And could you discuss the decision to make that distinction? And did you find that there was a gray area where it was hard to categorize something as explicitly expressed or implicitly expressed? And also, another part of this question is, how well do you think students might pick up on the more subtle and implicit prosocial utility value messages? And what experiments could you do to explore that?
Yeah, so the decision to focus on explicit prosocial utility value versus implicit, I think was influenced by both theoretical but then also practical reasons. So in theory, science has many, many uses for people, and people may or may not be able to see them. So implicitly, topics could be perceived in many different ways. So for example, if you take photosynthesis, one student might think, oh, this is a waste of time. Why am I here? Why am I studying this? I'm just going to memorize this model and then forget it after the test. And then another student could see it as valuable. They might be interested in addressing world hunger and maybe working with GMOs or other things. And so they might really see the prosocial value in it. So to study it, we wanted to make sure that connection was clear for that reason. And then practically, we wanted to find out how many connections we could find And I think had we tried to do implicit value, I think it would have been an impossible task because by definition, you infer it, right? So this is something that came up on day one of our training. So research assistants, they asked, how much mental gymnastics should I have to do before like I figure whether something has prosocial value or not? Because I think it might have it, but this other person may not think so. And so if you look at the code book that you can check out on the supplemental materials, you could download it. We specifically told our A's, our research assistants, that we shouldn't have to infer. So we shouldn't have to do mental gymnastics. It should be clear. There should be a concept or a piece of information with an application for people, for humans, for solving a problem, and that connection should be made clear. And so because we like operationalized it in that way, there was not as much gray area. There was in the training sessions because RAs were kind of figuring out how much they should infer, and we said, don't infer, it should just be there. And so in terms of your other questions, I mean, it's hard to say, but my guess is that I don't think students would pick up on subtle or prosocial messages in textbooks. But I do think that that's something that people could study in the future. So how concrete does a connection have to be? You can vary the concreteness, the specificity, that link in different ways and see if people still pick up on those messages even when it's subtle. I think that could absolutely be a future study to understand additional strategies for how to best communicate value in text and in curricula and learning materials. Absolutely, yeah.
We have a related question from Erica in the Q&A who says, I wonder if guided discussions that allow students to construct their own prosocial interpretations of scientific content would be even more effective than providing prosocial interpretations to them.
Yes, absolutely. That's the short answer, because they would be selecting something that is more meaningful to them. And so the idea that, utility value is in some sense personal. And so if you are coming up with it on your own, no one has to convince you. It came from you, and it's personal already. So I would suspect that would be a much stronger way to increase the perceptions that science is prosocial, and then by extension, enhance interest. So yes.
Great. All right. So, well, some STEM instructors are shifting away from using textbooks for a combination of reasons. They're shifting often to using open source materials in customized ways. And in some cases, it's in order to reduce costs for students and also to streamline, get rid of extraneous information.
Right.
And so what advice would you have for people who are taking this approach, since you are mainly focusing on textbooks, but how can you implement your ideas in situations where people are putting together their own course materials, finding online stuff, open source? What sorts of resources do you think might be out there that could be helpful?
Yeah, so my advice would be to get creative in those situations. Young people seem to have a very strong motivation to do meaningful work that is helpful to others. And so knowing that, you can ask yourself, how can my lectures, how can your assignments, your activities help students feel connected to that larger goal? So one suggestion, which is similar to I think it was Erica who made that last question, is to include writing assignments that prompt students to discuss how a concept could be used to benefit their communities, their family, people in general. Studies that have tested these written assignments, they show that they're hugely effective for changing perceptions, and then also increasing engagement, and they even translate to higher course grades. And these effects are stronger for people with lower perceptions of competence, first generation students, and also underrepresented minority students. And then in the case of the writing assignments, students would generate their own value. So it would remove the burden from instructors. Students would come up with their own unique connections, and by extension, they would be stronger and more effective. Another suggestion would be to contextualize learning activities. So this suggestion comes from the active learning literature. So providing providing context for a problem. So you can say like, oh, there's this community facing this issue, and your task is to try to solve it with the learning concepts for that week or for the task. So that would be my two sort of general recommendations, is to just be creative, put yourself in the student's shoes, and try to find ways to help students make those connections through lectures, activities, assignments.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so kind of zooming out to the big picture, when I was reading your paper, it reminded me of a study that I learned about a year ago that pinpointed one of the reasons that Black scientists have a lower NIH grant funding rate. And so I'm sure you're familiar with that work as well. And even though that work focused on people who are at a later career and life stage, and you were focusing on undergraduates, could you reflect on the parallels and how the take-home messages from the work on the NIH grant funding and on your work could be synthesized and then implemented at various levels?
Yeah, so you sent me that article earlier this week, and I saw huge parallels as I was reading it with that article and then this body of work that we were pulling from for this study. So in that article, essentially, Black scientists had a lower NIH funding rate. And one factor that accounted for why it might be that Black students are less, or Black scientists are less likely to get funding, to get grant funding, was because they were more likely to submit proposals that involved applying concepts to helping people, applying the science to directly improving the lives of others and improving communities. So this study to me suggests that the perception that science fields don't afford opportunities to help others and help communities is more widespread than just the undergraduate level. It could be also at the graduate level, faculty work. It could be that certain individuals' work, because it's community-based, isn't seen as rigorous enough or isn't seen as high quality. And then, as in this article, it also talked about that it could be at the institutional level, with grant funding opportunities. So I think that, and I've also experienced this, applying to graduate schools, where I was kind of told to keep the applied parts out of like my essays. So I think that these messages are important, because it says what's valued here and what isn't. And if I value helping people, this might not be the place for me. And that definitely has implications for motivation. So I think that at the institutional level, I think we should just reflect more on what our values are, and then try to create more alignment between the values that we espouse and the decisions that are actually taking place, from teaching to mentoring to research to funding. I think that there's a mismatch there, and just creating more alignment would be beneficial in general. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, once again, a reminder for attendees, please submit your questions in the Q&A feature. Maybe think about how Jeanette's findings could be applied to your own particular subfield, and identify challenges or questions you would have there, because we have plenty of time to address more questions. So please submit your questions. Maybe also zooming in, Jeanette, while we're waiting for people to submit questions, think about, knowing what you know now. What would you tell your earlier self as you were embarking upon this work? And this is also advice for other people who might be pursuing similar sorts of research. What would be helpful for people to hear who are aiming for this kind of focus?
Yeah, so if I could go back in time to when we were first starting this project, I think the one thing that I would change is that it would have been better if we had a bioed researcher on the team, because we were working on this chapter, and we had to make changes, we had to condense it, and so we were trying to make it coherent, and then also we had to find a certain topic, we had to find different connections, right, for that same topic. So it had to be a prosocial utility value connection, a general one, and a neutral one. And it was challenging to not have the content knowledge in biology. So I remember me and my co-authors, we were just like, what are phenolic compounds again? And we were just kind of like trying to figure it out and trying to come up with connections, and making that chapter like coherent. We had to like try to ask people to like read the chapter so that it made sense. And so I think just having a bioed researcher there, a student or a faculty member to kind of help guide us would have been a lot better, I think. More efficient, definitely. And so for people that are doing similar work, that would actually be my suggestion, is to, the study is very interdisciplinary, and so I think it would be better to just have diverse perspectives on your teams. I think it would be good. I think it's a learning opportunity, and I think it just makes research more fun when you're getting to know people through work, and getting all those ideas to better conduct a study. So. Yeah.
In your study of textbooks, you were looking at chemistry and physics textbooks as well, and you saw a pretty big difference in the number of times that prosocial utility value is mentioned in biology versus other fields. Why do you think there's such a difference, and what recommendations would you have for authors of textbooks across all the different fields who might try to claim that it's too much of a stretch to put these topics in there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the obvious reason is that bioed is also rated as higher providing prosocial value than the other two. Studies have shown that. And then the connections would just be more clear. So it's biology. So you're talking of diseases, you're talking about conditions, I'm sorry, and other sort of issues. So I think that the connections would just be more clear versus physics. You're talking about energy. But I do still think that it's possible. So just because it's challenging, I think it's possible to do. And I think if we could just sprinkle in some connections, add in the prosocial utility value, I do think it would help. We found that these effects were strong in biology, and this field is already seen as more prosocial than the other ones. So if we can add more prosocial utility value in the other disciplines where, you know, they have more like agentic cultural, it's seen as more agentic rather than communal. I think we would see even bigger effects on interest there and bigger improvements. So that would be my suggestion. Even though it's hard, we should do it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, here's a question that just came in. It's an anonymous attendee who says, I am new to this topic, but lately I've been thinking about how we can make educational experiences more meaningful. In your review of the literature, have you found studies that demonstrate strong benefits of community-engaged learning experiences on underrepresented minority students?
Yes, so I can't remember if they found effects, but I do know that there was one study who did service learning. I can't remember, my memory is a little foggy of the article, but it's by Amanda Diekman. She does a lot of this work, if you want to look at that. But they did service learning curricula, and they found that it was successful because, and you could imagine that it would be, because when you are engaged in meaningful experiences and you're learning at the same time and engaged with people, it's going to change your perceptions and it's going to make you more engaged if these are the types of things that are important to you. So I think that I have seen work like this, but I think that there's also more work to be done in terms of how to integrate those things into the classroom.
So looking forward, what sorts of questions are you pursuing now? Where is this field going, and what are the future directions to follow up on what you recently published? Yeah,
so at the moment, I'm not working on any follow-up studies with this one right now. I'm a graduate student, and so I have other projects, and then I also have an advisor, so I have to do that work as well. But in some of my other work, I'm interested in how women develop science identities through conversations with faculty, with family. How are those identities developed, and the stereotypes that exist around women's participation in the sciences. And then I'm also interested in teaching practices, which also includes this to some extent. Something I'm interested in cultural relevance in science teaching. And so using prosocial connections is absolutely one, because we know that Black, Latino, and Indigenous students tend to come from more interdependent cultures that highly value giving back and benefiting community, topics of familismo, family, and connection. So this is sort of relevant to that. And so just how to teach teachers and how to influence their approaches to learning using these techniques is something that I'm going to be working on in the next few years.
Got it. And I just asked you to look forward, but maybe our last question can be looking back for those who might be at a similar or earlier career stage. Can you talk a little bit about your path to where you are now and how you got interested in all of this in the first place?
How I got interested? Yeah. So my background is in social psychology. And at the time we were working on an intervention, one of the writing ones that I discussed. I was working on a project where we were essentially going into science classrooms, and we were going to test the effectiveness of these writing assignments on students' interest. And I became interested in this area of research because of other studies that I found that suggested that it's a powerful way to get students interested in these topics, and it actually translates to greater achievement. So the one study by Judy Harakovich, she found that these connections, making connections such as these, decreased the achievement gap for first generation minority students by like 61%. It was like a big figure, and I thought that was so cool that you can carefully do things in the learning environment to produce such big changes for students. And so I think that students, especially like first gen students and minority students, racial minority students, there's often this belief that it's me, like I'm not good, I can't get this, there's something wrong with me. And I think that if we can do things in the environment that work, we can change that and better support them. So I think my motivation comes from the fact that I see that these things are powerful and they're important, and they can actually influence people and affect their lives in very positive ways.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jeanette. I'm definitely going to be thinking about your work as I rework some of my own courses in the future.
Great.
So I think now if you could reshare the slides and show the second to last slide. This will be a prompt to our participants. And so to everyone in the audience, thanks so much for joining us. We would like you to spend a couple minutes now using the chat box to reflect on today's session and write down one interesting thing that you learned today. And this will help us get some feedback on the webinar series as well.